And we are live.
Good evening. I call the March 16th, 2021 meeting of the Community Task Force to order. Thank you for joining us this evening via live stream. We are conducting this meeting online as is allowed by state law under the current state of emergency due to the pandemic. With that being said, could we please have roll call?
Mr. Ampanza,
Here.
Ms. Maria, Mr. Robinson,
Here.
Mr. Wayne,
Here.
Mr. Knappy, Ms. Bannister, Mr. White, Mr. Shoji,
Here.
Ms. Adams, Ms. Smith. Here. Mr. Jordan, Mr. Saccapraya, Ms. Viliconti, Ms. Mercado, and Ms. Bocana.
Here.
Thank you for that. Members of the task force should have received the minutes of our previous meeting. Does anyone have any questions or changes regarding those minutes? I'll accept the motion to approve the minutes.
I move to approve the minutes from the last meeting as proposed.
Thank you. Is there a second? All in favor, please say aye. Oh, wait, is there a second for the motion?
I'd second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, please say aye. All right, thank you. With that being said, we will move on to our subcommittee updates. Reporting first would be economic and infrastructure. Bridget, we are unable to hear you. No, we cannot hear you. Okay, you can figure that out. I'll go ahead and start with the communication education subcommittee report. So we had our meeting this past Thursday. We unfortunately did not have enough members attend the meeting that we had hoped for. So with that being said, we just generally had a brief discussion and overlook at our aspirational goals. Our next meeting coming up, we hope to be able to go more in depth with our aspirational goals and have a deeper dialogue about that. So that's for that communication and education. Is there anybody from the youth subcommittee who would like to report out?
Yeah, I can report on that. We have been meeting weekly for the last 4 or 5 weeks now, and with our last meeting, we met with Police Chief Mr. Paez. But with before that, we have been talking about how we should plan to get our plan out to city council. And what we came up with is we want to engage the youth to have them understand our needs. And what we mean by that, we haven't really gotten into the specifics. And so our next upcoming meetings, we're still going to be meeting weekly every Monday. And so we want to continue to plan that out and get more specific ideas on that. But something from that is we want to formalize the subcommittee. So even when if this task force it comes to an end, we still want to have a youth subcommittee, which would just be a youth committee then with a chair and like a vice chair and plan that out. We also want to work with school systems, recreation, the arts, athletics, and Centero to build programs that will serve all. And so by that, we want to make make it a citywide like plan for everyone to be involved. We want to add attractive environments and so on and so forth. And we also want to treat the youth as a relevant stakeholder moving forward through city events and training. So that's what we have come up with so far. And hopefully by next time we have a meeting, I can expand it now on our first point that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you for that. Bridget, do you want to test out your microphone now?
Is it working now, you guys?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I have no idea. It worked and then it didn't work. I'm sorry. That sounds amazing. The youth committee. I love the idea of continuing that that committee beyond the task force. So economic and infrastructure subcommittee. It's maybe 2 minutes update. We've been pretty busy, so we want to share with you guys what we've been up to. As a reminder, economics and infrastructure basically has 3 priority areas. You know, that if we think of the Beaverton plan, the priority areas that we have in our subcommittee, it's not just 1, but it's 3: economic empowerment, mobility or transportation, and housing. So we actually met this morning as a subcommittee. It is recorded and available to the public and to any of you if you want to watch it. We heard from Director Chaz Frutal of the Dublin Entrepreneurial Center, also referred to as DEC. And we just wanted to get a sense of like what that entrepreneurial center is doing as they're supporting startups and entrepreneurial businesses in the Dublin area, and if there's an opportunity to expand on that, on their focus, or use them as a model to further DEI goals so that we could foster more Black and Latino owned businesses in the area. The other presentation we heard from was from city staff, J.M. Rayburn, and Share Mobility's Ryan McManus, who gave a presentation about basically a multi-year study that Dublin is trying to finish up about mobility or transportation in the city. And the relevance to our task force is that they are basically helping, you know, folks who need help to get around the city, and that includes seniors, disabled folks, and individuals who are traveling to Dublin primarily on the bus, but then they need help with what's called the last mile, getting from the bus stop to their work, to their place of work or their employer. And that can be super expensive for folks. So this study should end within the next year, year and a half, and implementation with mobility hubs. And we're hoping that it will support some of our DEI goals. And then finally, I just want to let you guys know that our subcommittee, you know, we generated some ideas over the last couple of weeks on the 3 priority areas, and we actually put together a list of ideas under the economic empowerment priority area. And today in the subcommittee, we asked staff to go ahead and share it with the entire task force. So I think that you guys will see our draft recommendations in email. And it's a few pages, but we tried to be aspirational in our approach, while also being realistic if that balance is possible. And we're looking forward to feedback, not just from city staff, but from the public, from you guys, so that we can, you know, put these recommendations into a final form that the task force might be able to recommend to city council. Finally, I didn't know if I know Erica couldn't make it tonight. I don't know, Esau, if there's something else that you'd like to add that I missed.
No, ma'am. I think you covered it all.
Okay, thanks for your time, you guys. That's it.
Thank you for that. We'll now proceed with city update.
So Homer, I'll let you go ahead and lead that. So.
Okay.
Could I just make a quick comment before Homer starts?
Sure.
I don't want to break any rules by commenting, but the city of Columbus, with its Smart Columbus or Smart Cities grant, has a huge amount of research on last mile. I don't know if you consulted with them or touch base with anybody from Smart Cities or Smart Columbus, but they research that back and forth.
I'm assuming, JM, that you guys are in touch with that info and expertise?
Yes, that is correct. And we work a lot with our regional partners at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, as well as CODA, to meet these goals.
Okay, awesome. So can I go ahead and start now? Okay. Okay, so I'm Homer Rogers. I'm the Assistant City Manager and Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for the City of Dublin. And Steve Francis is actually going to be joining with me. He's with Franchise D&I Solutions, and he's been contracting, consulting with us, helping us out with a lot of the work that we've been doing here of late. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and dive into this presentation, and just start out by saying, good evening, members of the Dublin Community Task Force. The purpose of my update, let me go ahead and share these slides, I guess that would be helpful. So the purpose of my update is to provide you with some background regarding Dublin's history pertaining to matters related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and bring you up to date on current activities also related to the same. So what you see before you with this next slide is a timeline of various actions and policies that have been enacted since Dublin first officially became a city in 1987. Resolutions and ordinances are issued by the City Council, and administrative orders are issued under the authority of the City Manager. They can have effect on both city staff and the residents and businesses of Dublin, depending on the circumstances. As we walk through this timeline, please keep in mind that when the city was first formed, it consisted of a staff of less than 50 people, and it has grown over the last 33 plus years to about 400 permanent employees with upwards of 500 seasonal and temporary employees. The population of Dublin, Ohio has also grown from less than 17,000 to about 49,000, during that time. So why is this important to consider? It's because unlike some larger, more well-established cities like Columbus, Dublin has only recently emerged from its infancy over the last 3 decades and has had a shifting demographic during that same period. Back when it first became a city, the city was more homogenous. There's been a lot of businesses come into Dublin. A lot of people have moved into it. The residences have changed, and along with the growth, the diversity of the city has grown along with it and changed along with it as well. So, while some people may, when you first walk into the city, just think of it as any other city, you have to keep in mind that the bigger cities in this nation have been around for 100, 200 years, and so they have been dealing with a lot of these issues, whereas Dublin, it's just been in the last couple of decades that has happened. So as Dublin has matured, it's become more introspective in many ways to include diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the other thing I have to remind you of is the whole discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion back in 1987 really wasn't a topic that was talked about in that sense so much. It has really become more of a conversation in the last few decades. Before it was mostly equal opportunity, equal employment opportunity, discrimination, and it was kind of couched in those terms. So DEI is really a newer concept that we've been dealing with, since the city was first formed. So just walk through the timeline here with you. You can see I've got several things that have happened, in terms of administrative orders, starting from 1989 through 2002. And you can also see over onto the right-hand side that those administrative orders have also been through revisions along the way as well. So like the AO 2.12, affirmative action and EEO plan for the recruitment of law enforcement personnel was first written in 1992, but it was most recently revised in 2015. So a lot of our older administrative orders have been reviewed at some point in time. The thing I would also point out to you is when you look at in 2002 at those AOs 2.2, 2.3, and 2.49, all have to do with sexual harassment and disrespectful, malicious, or abusive conduct in the workplace. Those AOs also had a provision within them that prohibited retaliation. So anybody that would come forward with a complaint in those regards would also have a mechanism that if anybody tried to, retaliate or there was any reprisal against it, those people could be held accountable for doing such. So there was protections built in for anybody that was coming forward to render any complaints in those regards. So more recently in 2015, the City Council did approve or sign Resolution 8615, which was rejecting discrimination of any kind and was also urging the Ohio General Assembly to consider legislation to ensure equal opportunity and respect for all persons. We were asked, at that point in time, if we would, participate and support that, and this was the way that we went about doing that. At the same time, the city manager also signed AO 2.66, which is our discrimination policy, so that there was a mechanism in place for anybody that felt, discrimination within the city work staff, to be able to come forward. And then also the Human Rights Campaign, don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but that is a group that is mostly focused on the LGBTQ, plus, interests, and they do a municipal equality index that they put out once a year where they rate various cities around the nation. In the state of Ohio, they rate the 6 largest cities and then 2 more mid-sized cities, Dublin being one of them. And then all the rest of the cities have not been brought into that index yet, but we participate in that and we update that on a annual basis. Moving into 2016, you can see we implemented some other policies. One was AO 2.73, which speaks to transgender use of restroom, locker room, and shower, facilities, within the city. And our stance on that is, it allows people to use the facility that coincides with the gender that they identify with. The only exception to that is in our Dublin City Rec Center, because it is more family oriented. There are some special rules there, but we have facilities where people, they're single occupancy or family use, type facilities there that people can use in that regard.
Let me just chime in. When I was at the City of Columbus, the NCAA basketball tournament lost a huge amount of revenue because they were not willing to move off of this very issue, the bathroom stance. And so Columbus benefited from it by hosting its first ever women's NCAA final because of their rigidity in not wanting to move on, transgender restroom policies of all things. So I think that's a significant step for the city.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. AO 2.74, our lactation policy, looking to make the workplace more inclusive for mothers. We did put that policy in place so that we could afford, nursing mothers an ability to, express, milk and everything in the workplace. So we implemented that policy. And then at the same time, in 2016, we also, because of the ruling from the Supreme Court, we also extended our paid leave provisions and health benefits to same-sex marriages, as well. So our health and leave provisions do cover that for our same-sex marriages, which we do have a few within the city. 2017, you see again that the City Council put forth Resolution 3717. Again, it was a resolution combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, and discrimination based on religion, belief, or ethnicity. And again, it reemphasized that we reject discrimination of any kind. And then also in 2017, there was a modification to our health benefits plan to cover gender dysphoria and gender transformation treatment. And then also in 2017, a group of 3 Dublin teen residents helped launch the Martin Luther King Sunday Suppers, which brought together neighbors, leaders, and students and community members to discuss issues that were affecting the community involving diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then
Yeah,
Chief Pice,
I gotta say, yay, Kofi for that one, right, Kofi?
yeah, awesome. And then Chief Pice, you can feel free to chime in on this one if you want. But in 2018, the police department also conducted research into improving diversity and equity in recruiting and hiring that lead to improved outreach, education opportunities, and formation of a diversity and inclusion unit within the police department itself. And that effort, reached into several different demographic, subsets, within the city of Dublin itself. Looked at the Chinese community, Japanese community, pretty sure the Indian community, was all engaged, with that at the time. So Chief, I don't know if you had any additional comments that you wanted to share about that one.
The only thing else I would offer is that foundation for that informal group and advising us on improving our recruiting efforts led to us having the foundation for our current Chiefs Advisory Committee. So there are members who have been actively engaged with us in helping us understand how to do a better job of reaching a larger population for our recruiting efforts for officers that are still with us as part of the advisory committee. And so it was great foundation set by Chief Heinz that led us to the point we are today with the Chiefs Advisory Committee, and we hope to continue well into the future.
Thanks, Chief. So again, as time has gone on, the city has started to become more introspective and started to look at itself. And so in 2019, we actually started the initial stages of trying to, figure out what we needed to do in terms of diversity and inclusion. So we started, into the beginning stages of developing a strategic plan for the city. And at that time, we engaged Janetta Darno with Strategic Human Resources to help us out with that. And Stephen Francis was, again, brought in, at that time as well to help her out with helping the city in that regard. And during that time, toward the end of 2019, we came up with a couple of definitions for what diversity, in terms of our staff, our internal staff, what diversity meant to us. And so that first thing we came up with was, we are a team of different and unique qualities which enable us to best serve our community in terms of our diversity statement. And then the inclusion statement that we had come up with at that time was, we welcome and expect diversity, and we provide opportunities for all team members to contribute to the city's success. So that was toward the end of 2019. And then we started into 2020. And as you know, the thing that helped form this task force was Resolution 3720, and then later on 4120, which is the City Council directing the formation of this task force, the Chief Advisory Council, and then a review of the city's policies, practices, and training pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I did that assessment myself, along with assistance of several staff members. And we provided that report to you, earlier on when the community task force first was formed. So if you refer back to that document, you can see that full report that was given to council, first, and then you were provided a copy of it. Also in 2020, we have assigned 2 LGBTQ liaisons, one assigned to the Office of the City Manager, and that would be J.M. Rayburn, who is on this meeting with us. And then the other one is Officer Amber McCloskey in the police department. And they're both doing a great job with that so far. And then, we have been doing, diversity, training, throughout the years, but we started to take a refresh look at that. And during 2020, for the first time, we actually did it in an e-learning, module through, using Cornerstone as a platform. And so what else do we have going on in 2020 and 2021, moving forward? So Janetta Darno had, moved on, and so we still have Steve Francis working with us, and his company is Franchise D&I Solutions, and he'll be briefing you here in just a couple of minutes on the next aspect of this briefing. So anyway, we did the appraisal that I talked about earlier, the internal assessment, and then Steve actually helped us do an appraisal of using a tool that he has, and we had key staff members involved with that. And along with that appraisal, we also have been going through what's called a SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we see in the city. And from that, we will be formulating goals and objectives, and recommending those, from city staff. And we'll be sharing those with you, I'm sure, at a later point in time as we complete that work. And then we've also drafted a mission and vision statement pertaining to diversity and inclusion as part of that process. And so the things that we're focusing on, as I have listed there, are specifically, human resources that affects the city, our purchasing and contracting procedures, our community relations and philanthropy, and then again, developing a strategic plan and implementing that, and having accountability toward goals and objectives. So again, we do have more training that is scheduled in 2021, and Steve is going to be helping us out with that, with a focus on implicit bias training. And he just did a pilot with several key staff members here on the 9th of March, and I can tell you it was an excellent training session, lasted 2 hours, and I think it's going to be very beneficial going forward. And then the other thing he had done with us was went through a training session with all of the directors in the city, which was based upon a peacock in the land of penguins. And I'll let Steve talk to that a little bit, if before he moves on. But at this point, that pretty much is where we're at. So any questions before I hand it over to Steve? Okay, so Steve, I will go to the next slide here and let you take it away. If you could just take a second, just talk about that peacock in the land of penguins training. I think that'd be very beneficial. Are you there, Steve?
Thanks, Homer, Dana, and the task force for allowing me to be with you tonight. Peacock in the Land of Penguins is a best-selling book that's been out for a while on DEI, and it talks about a colorful, flamboyant peacock that is recruited by these uniform penguins that all look the same. They were intrigued by the flash and flare and intelligence of the peacock, but they wanted that peacock to conform to what they expected that peacock to be successful. You've heard the expression, probably some of you need to be more like Dana if you want to, be successful here. Right? That's the kind of theme that ran throughout the book and throughout the workshop of the webinar. And it covers a lot of different areas of DEI, inclusive leadership, stereotypes, implicit bias, marginalization, adaptation versus assimilation, the business case for diversity. And when you don't let folks be their true self, they leave and take all that creativity with them. So it was a great exercise, and the implicit bias and managing racism and implicit bias workshop will be a very beneficial workshop for not only leadership, but for line staff as well. This link is from a resource that I've been providing to several of my clients. The Pacific University of Oregon has a very extensive list of terms, or glossary of terms, for DEI. And it's alphabetized, and it's very extensive. It's probably 12 pages long. But I defer to you to consult that at your leisure. I've just picked about 12 terms, but as Homer scrolls through these, you can see the plethora of terms that are provided, all kinds of terminology that really you as advisory committee and task force members need to be well versed in. And I just picked a few out to give you examples of how people struggle with certain definitions and terminology that are used quite frequently in the diversity, equity, and inclusion profession. So let's go to the first slide of this. African American. Can someone read that for me? Can you read that enough to read it out loud?
Refers to the ethnic group of Americans who come from African descent.
And compare that to black. Can somebody read black for me? Anybody?
I'll
Any
read.
various, oh,
Various
sorry.
populations that have a dark pigmentation of skin who identify as Black, including those in the African diaspora and within Africa, should be capitalized.
So I'm sure many people struggle with, should I refer to this individual as African American or Black? And I also bring to your attention BIPOC, Black Indigenous People of Color, a term commonly used to describe individuals who are not considered white. Between African American, BIPOC, and Black, I'll just give you my commentary. The golden rule of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of struggling on how to refer to folks is to simply ask them, right? So the culturally competent way to approach this topic is, I want to be sure that I'm correct on this. How would you like to be identified? African American, people of color, Black, and that's not offensive, right? You're trying to learn and understand. The three magic words in diversity, equity, and inclusion is help me understand. Help me understand. So that's not a condescending phrase. It's an indication that you want to learn and be more competent in how to respectfully address people that want to be referred in a certain way. Ageism is the second definition on this page. Prejudice, thoughts, discriminatory actions based on differences in age, usually that of younger persons against older people. So this is the young folks discriminating against the older folks, or corporations in general, organizations discriminating against those who are considered over the hill. And you see ageism rearing its head, particularly in COVID, when there's a need to hire back folks that were furloughed or laid off, and those that are in the baby boomer generation or older, like me, are not top of the list of the folks that are called back to fill jobs that are vacant, right? So that's how ageism is rearing its head in the age of COVID. Now, people of color, although it's politically correct to refer to people as people of color, you marginalize their true cultural identity, right? A Haitian doesn't want to be referred to as a person of color. They want to be referred to as a Haitian, right? A Chinese or a Korean person doesn't want to be referred to as a person of color. They want to be referred to as Korean or Chinese. So, and we see in ethnicity that it's a social construct. And I want to be clear that race is also a social construct. It doesn't exist. It's fake. It's a classification system that's humanly invented, just like ethnicity. So a social construct which divides individuals into smaller groups based on characteristics such as shared sense of group membership, values, behavior patterns, etc., language. So you see Haitian, African American, those are ethnicities, which is a social construct, which is described more generally as a Black race. Again, a social construct. Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese are ethnicities to fall into a general category of Asian race. Cherokee, Mohawk, Navajo are ethnicities that are comprised within this social construct we call Native American. And Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican are also ethnicities that are comprised or grouped in a race we call Latino or Hispanic. So again, I advocate cultural orientation versus race, since race is a social construct. It tells me a whole lot more if somebody says, I'm Polish, Irish American, than they tell me they're white, right? That doesn't tell me anything. And that cultural orientation is rich, it's unique, it's valuable. And so we need to let people self-identify what their cultural orientation is. And this that help me understand, that allows them to express and explain how they want to be referred, Black, African American, whatever, or Polish versus white. Let's go to the next slide. Equality and equity often get mixed up. Equality is the same. Equity is looking at the unique, specific needs of an individual and making sure that you, as whatever role you play, ensure that they have access to the same opportunity as others who aren't given equality. So equality is an assumption. Everybody can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but that's not true. Everybody doesn't start at the same point of the starting line, but equity requires that we make sure that they end up at the same finish line. So equity is a state of affairs in which all people within a specific society or isolated group have the same status in certain aspects, including civil rights, freedom of speech, etc. And then equity takes into consideration the fact that social identifiers, such as race and all those socially constructed things, do in fact affect equality, right? Those things called race negate equality. So equity requires that we even the playing field because of the disparate treatment of folks who are put in racial categories. Big difference there. And then inclusive language is another one I wanted to point out. This refers to non-sexist language or language that includes all persons in its references. For example, a writer needs to proofread his work excludes females due to the masculine reference of the pronoun. Likewise, a nurse must disinfect her hands is exclusive of males and stereotypes nurses as mostly females. And so again, I understand that City of Dublin is already doing an audit of some of its printed material to make sure that it's inclusive and not exclusive in terms of the language used. But this is something that comes up when we do systemic and organizational audits and assessments to make sure that we scorch ground zero to make sure that everything is inclusive and somewhat open versus exclusive. Any questions on any of those before we move on to the next slide? All right, let's go to the next slide. The two on this slide are microaggressions. Commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, racial slights. These messages may be sent verbally. For example, you speak good English. Non-verbally, clutching one's purse more tightly around people from certain ethnicities or races. I've experienced myself when I walk on elevators, people kind of clutch their purses and move away from me as if, I'm some sort of threat. Or environmentally, symbols like the Confederate flag or using Native American mascots. The Cleveland Indians baseball team is experiencing that in spades right now, as did the Washington Redskins, which is now the Washington football team, based on public pressure to get rid of derogatory team names that tend to disrespect and denigrate certain segments of our society. Such communications are usually outside the level of conscious awareness. So it's like an implicit bias. They don't intend to offend, but we teach in diversity that you have to manage your impact along with your intent. You have to anticipate the impact, regardless of what your intent was. And so that takes work. We have to anticipate both intent and impact. And then race, a social construct, just like ethnicity, that artificially divides individuals into distinct groups based on characteristics such as physical appearance, particularly skin color, ancestral heritage, cultural affiliation or history, ethnic classification, and or the social, economic, and political needs of a society at a given period of time. So scientists agree that there is no biological or genetic basis for racial categories. In other words, let me paraphrase, there's no gene, chromosome, or DNA in our bodies called race. It does not exist. Yet it's not biologically real, but it's very socially and politically real. Take for example, the census that was just conducted in 2020, putting us in those racial boxes that are not real, like Black, Asian, white, Hispanic, 2 or more. I'd love for somebody to introduce me to a 2 or more. I haven't seen that kind of person walking around. Any questions on that before we go to the next slide? Any comments? Who disagrees that race and ethnicity are social constructs? Anybody disagree with that? Okay, good. The last 2 terms I'll discuss today are white fragility, discomfort, and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. Prime example of this, I gave a workshop the other day with a different client, and we talked about Black Lives Matters. And they said, give me a break. I'm tired of this. They're shoving it down our throat. Black Lives Matter is on the end zone. It's on the basketball court. It's on their jerseys. It's on their sneakers. Give me a break. That's an example of white fragility. Because in our society, the dominant culture is white. And so they're not used to hearing or seeing on any sense of frequency another race mentioned so much. Or they subconsciously feel some sense of guilt for the frequent mention of Black oppression. They shouldn't, again, during George Floyd, many of my friends said, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I feel so guilty. I'm sorry about what's happening. And I responded to them and say, well, wait a minute, did you kill George Floyd? Let me understand his. I'm confused. I mean, it's not for people to feel guilty about. It's for you to use those 3 magic words. Help me understand how you feel about Black Lives Matter. Because they might feel that Blue Lives Matters or All Lives Matters, and they can help you understand why they feel that way, right? So the key is we have to exist or coexist in this real racially charged environment. The last one I want to talk about is white privilege. And first, let me disclaim, white privilege, I've talked to a lot of folks who are very defensive about white privilege. They disclaim that they are privileged. They worked hard for everything they had. They came from nothing and to get where they are. And that's true. White privilege is involuntary. Folks don't ask for the privilege, but by virtue of them being white, they inherit the privilege. One example, plain example, simple example. The flesh-colored Band-Aids don't look like my flesh color, right? So I put a Band-Aid on, that pink Band-Aid, and it was intended for white folks with that flesh color. However, I have to put that Band-Aid on if I want to stop the bleeding, right? Now, certainly they've come out with different multi-color Band-Aids, but you get my point. Hairstyle and hair care products are relegated to a certain aisle for Black folks who have curly or coarse hair versus the general hair care products are in the general hair care category. I mean, there's a lot of different examples, right? It doesn't make you good or bad people. What we try to do in DEI is make sure that people are aware that they may be benefiting involuntarily from white privilege, and to call it out or be aware of it at the very least, so that they understand from a systemic and societal standpoint what's going on. Does that make sense at all? Any questions or comments or any other feedback from these terms? Again, there's a very exhaustive list from the link that Homer showed. I encourage you to get well versed in these vast array of definitions, because you'll need to be familiar with them as you continue to do this important work.
Thank you, Steve. I think it's helpful to, or was helpful to me, to understand white privilege after reading Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, where which I would highly recommend it to everybody. Caste, as in CASTE. It just really, it's almost as if we're all in a cast, as if we're on a stage, CAST. We're in a cast and we're all playing our roles in society, which is just intrinsically based on our impressions of each other, which are often superficial. You know, our assessments of each other based on how much money somebody might have, what color they are, what ethnicity, and there's just inherent expectations about one another based on the role our society expects everyone to play. And she just does a fascinating job of exploring how we're all, like you said, involuntarily almost just part of something that we don't realize we're part of. It's really insightful, and I found it really helpful to understand something like white privilege.
I'll break it down on a very fundamental level. Many of you may have heard or seen a video of a doll's video, and this was in the exhibit that came to Columbus, Race, Why Are We So Different, at COSI. But children of all races and ethnicities were asked a question. A fair-skinned doll and a dark-skinned doll. And they asked the question, which doll is prettier? And even the black children picked the light-skinned doll. Which doll is bad? The black kids picked the black-skinned or the dark-skinned doll. So that's the result of societal norms being barraged into people's psyche for many generations of thinking that white is good, black is not. And again, it's nobody's fault. It's just our societal norms that you know, they say that implicit bias is like a fog. We breathe it in every day without even realizing it. And it shapes the way we think and see the world. And so we have to be on guard every day, all day, to identify those biases when they pop up, and to manage them, to prevent them from clouding our judgment and our decision making. Sorry if I took a little bit too much time, Dana, but
no, that's good. Thank you, Steve. And I just wanted to share with the group that, you know, that was a great discussion and insight to the glossary of terms. And again, just kind of circling back to Homer's purpose tonight was to give you that update that I have been promising for a couple months on what is the city as an organization doing, how are we advancing that ball internally as an organization, and as the resolution that council passed says, I'm looking at this task force to help us out along that journey, and even beyond the life of the task force, should we have an advisory committee or something of that nature to help us out. So this is a journey we're on, and it's, you know, and we want to get there faster rather than later too in this process. So that's a big part of it as well. So I just wanted to let you all know we're working that way as an organization. Steve, as you know, as Homer mentioned, and as Steve has said, is helping us a great deal with that process. And then Steve kind of had a dual hat tonight with talking about this glossary of terms, because what we said is if we're going to use a framework going forward, we sort of need a basic understanding of what common terms could or should be that our community can go to and reference as well. And I think that this glossary is a great example out of Oregon, or there could be others out there, but this is the one that I think Steve is recommending. And I ask that you, as a task force, spend a little time with if you can, and then let us know if you think that's an adoptable glossary of terms as we go forward. And the other thing I like about that is you can click that link and get that list from A to Z, but at the same time, this organization is keeping those updated and relevant, and and rather than adopting a list that's sort of on a shelf and not a living document. So I think that can be very helpful to us as well. So anyway, so that's what that subcommittee was about tonight, and just wanted to sort of put that in that context. So I want to thank Steve, I want to thank Homer for all their work and all that they're doing to help our organization to be better, and also to help this task force.
Thank you for those presentations. They're very informational and useful. Definitely will go back and check it out. With that being said, is there a staff update on demographics?
Actually, I had hoped that Kirby might be able to speak to a little bit. He's been dual hatting tonight. He was in the meeting and attending a graduate school class at the same time. So he was kind of, oh, there he is, toggling back and forth. Kirby, if you're consumed with your class, don't get in trouble with the professor. But if you want to just mention anything about demographics, go right ahead.
We're talking about the titles of our papers, so I'm fine to step away for a moment. Good evening, task force members. I have been working with Rick France, part of our data analytics team, to pull together demographic information within the city of Dublin, Franklin County as a region, and also the state of Ohio, in comparing some of our demographics regarding ethnicity, but also housing and the workforce. I've also reached out to Homer. We're going to pull together some stats regarding the composition of the city of Dublin's workforce and compare it to those demographics that I had mentioned before. So I have started pulling together a draft for that and should have something for you to review at your next meeting.
Thank you for that. Moving on, is there going to be a school update today?
There's not a school update tonight, but I would ask that, and I know that Jamil mentioned it briefly in his update, the youth committee subcommittee got to meet with both superintendents of schools a couple meetings ago, and I don't know if they want to mention anything about that or not in particular. You kind of alluded to it earlier, but you're welcome to do that if you find that a helpful update.
I mean, I can touch up on it a bit. We talked, it was 2 weeks ago prior to when Dr. Hoadley resigned, and we talked with him and the superintendent of Hilliard. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but we were just trying to come up with the ways on how to, just get the youth engaged on how to, I don't know if this is the right word, but like get rid of discrimination and racism and have discussions at a younger age. So we were trying to get them to talk with the school board maybe on discussing if we could implement a way to have conversations in like 5th grade, like the guidance counselors to them, so that when it gets to middle school or high school, actions of discrimination and racism will be lesser than they are now. So we were just having a conversation with them about that.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, so we were lucky to get both superintendents on the same night, Dr. Marshausen and Dr. Hoadley, and really appreciated the youth subcommittee, really wanting to have time with them. So thanks guys for doing that.
Homer, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say Marshausen, so Dana got it.
Okay. JM, do you have any update for us about LGBTQ?
I do, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, members of the task force. If you recall, in previous meetings, we've touched on a city ordinance that the City of Dublin could consider as part of protections for the LGBTQ populations. Where I want to take it to this evening is more of a legislative update at the state and federal level. Excuse me, and I'll give you a recap here. Should take a few minutes. I do want to bring awareness to the Ohio Fairness Act This was introduced for the 10th time this March, and it would make it illegal for employers, landlords, schools, and other kinds of public accommodations to deny their services based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Ohio, in fact, is one of 27 states where someone can be denied housing or other services like at restaurants or retail establishments based on their sexual orientation. So this bill would outline all of that by adding sexual orientation and gender identity into Ohio's existing anti-discrimination law. Now, you may ask yourself, didn't the US Supreme Court already decide this last summer? And the answer is yes and no. Last June, the Supreme Court handed down an opinion that someone who was fired for being gay was discrimination based on sex. So that case did clear the way for some protections, but it didn't really deal with other areas of discrimination like housing, education, and public accommodation. So while there is a state level Fairness Act in Ohio, there's also a federal Equality Act that is in play. The US House of Representatives did pass this act, but it is possibly lacking bipartisan support in the US Senate. And it's important to consider both of these because there are differences. The biggest difference, for example, is the federal piece of legislation about anti-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity applies to businesses with more than 50 employees, while the Ohio law applies to those with more than 4 employees. So there are arguments that could be made that passing both would be advantageous to the LGBTQ communities in Ohio and beyond. So like I said, the chance of these becoming law at the federal level, it's uncertain given the support or lack of support in the Senate. In Ohio, the Ohio Fairness Act does have bipartisan support and sponsorship for the first time, but we'll see if this makes a difference in this session of the Ohio Assembly. So that is my update. If you have opinions, I would say reach out to your representative, ask how they feel about it and how they're going to vote. But it's a good conversation to have nonetheless when we think about protections for the LGBTQ plus communities. So that's my update. Happy to answer any questions.
If I could just chime in again, I told you about the cities that lost out on the NCAA tournament hosting opportunities and lost a lot of money because of the bathroom issue. While I was Chief Diversity Officer for the City of Columbus, we were putting together a development package to attract Amazon here. You remember when one of their major hubs was going to locate here, and one of the significant points of consideration was whether the state and or city had legislation that protected the rights of LGBTQ individuals. And because there was such, disagreement in the state capitol on this topic, I'm not saying that that was the reason why we didn't get it, but it was not a good look based on the development proposal that we submitted to land a huge development opportunity for this region, let alone the city of Columbus. So,
Thank you for that. And we will be moving on to Chief's Advisory Committee update.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Yes, the Chiefs Advisory Committee did meet between our last meeting and this meeting and went over, as planned, continued discussion of the school resource officers as well as some of the specific policies of the Dublin Police Department. So with the school resource officer conversation, we heard from former officer Chuck Colliers, who is now with the Dublin City School District and works as the coordinator of safety and security. So we heard the perspective of the district about the SRO program. And along with that, we also heard from one of the committee members that shared with his research about the best practices and survey results gathered from other school districts. And all of those data points point to a healthy state of Dublin's SRO program. I think that is the consensus among the committee. And the discussion about specific policies within the police department, and more specifically, the discussion was around response to resistance and subject control policy. That was probably the second half of the conversation. And we heard from the Lieutenant Bertanzi, I think, of the police department, who went over the statistics for us when it came to, for example, incidents of control techniques being used, or the reasons for those techniques being used. So those numbers are available. If you are looking for them, I'd be more than happy to share. If you're wondering what we're talking about, we are talking about things like use of taser, or expandable baton, or specialty impact munitions or firearms. So we're talking about some nitty-gritty things here, and the discussion on that topic will continue in the next committee meeting as well. And there was also a report from the chief at the beginning of the meeting. I almost forgot to mention this, about the fact that we would like the Chiefs Advisory Committee to take on the responsibility of coming up with the proposals, the recommendations for the City Council in the area of public safety, specifically the policing within Dublin. And I believe there will be more conversations between the chair and the vice chair of two entities to iron things out as far as that goes. I think that concludes my report.
Thank you for that. That will conclude the updates. We'll now move on to new business. Is there any new business or discussion from members of the task force that they would like to bring up?
Actually, I had a question. Last meeting, Superintendent Hoadley mentioned that the Dublin City Schools is hiring a director of diversity and inclusion, right? So I'm not sure whether the youth group, whether you guys receive any update on that or not. Any information? No? Okay. All right. Thank you.
I did actually talk to Superintendent Holy a couple of days ago, and based on the news of his transitioning out of his role, he did mention that the search for that DEI coordinator is still on track, and they do expect that decision to be made, within the next month.
That I was going to chime in too. That was my understanding, and I'll be reaching out to the interim superintendent here this week. I wanted to give him a couple days to find his office before I gave him a phone call. So I'll be reaching out this week and see if I can get a office call or a meeting with him and introduce myself. At least make him aware of this effort that we're doing here, and perhaps we can get him to attend. I think it might be a little bit hard, to get him in attendance, at least initially, because he's probably going to try to be figuring out what he's going to be doing here. But as you know, he's a well-tenured superintendent. I'm sure he'll grasp that pretty quickly, and hopefully we'll get a chance to interact with him.
I'm sorry. I also wanted to add, Dr. Hoadley, we crossed paths, and I don't think he intend to completely dismiss the meetings. He mentioned to me that he wanted to still keep collaborating with the educational and inclusion meetings and working with the parents. So I imagine that right now with the transition, they're probably pretty busy, but if we give them time, they're both gonna be included and working with us. So I am also giving him time to kind of settle in his new role, and we probably are gonna continue working in these tasks.
last call for any new business anyone has. Hearing nothing, I will accept a motion to adjourn today's meeting.
I move to adjourn the meeting.
I second that.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 With that being said, today's meeting has concluded. Everyone, please have a nice week.
Thank
Thank you. Have a good
Thanks,
evening.
everybody. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.